I was 62 years old when I learned the most dangerous thing a woman can be is successful and alone. If you had told me, even 5 years earlier, that remarriage would nearly cost me my freedom, my legacy, and everything I had spent my adult life building, I would have laughed and poured you another glass of wine. I wasn't naive, I wasn't desperate, I wasn't weak, or at least, that's what I believe. But danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes smiling, holding your hand, telling you how proud it is of you. My name is Aurora Blake, and before I ever met my second husband, I owned every inch of my life. Let me take you back. I bought my first piece of land in 1991, long before it was worth anything. It wasn't glamorous, just dry hills and stubborn soil on the edge of a coastal valley most developers ignored. I was 36, newly divorced, raising my daughter alone, and working 2 jobs to stay afloat. People told me I was reckless. Banks told me no. Friends suggested I sell before I buried myself in debt. But I had vision and, more importantly, I had endurance. Over the next 3 decades, I turned that land into a luxury olive estate and boutique press, supplying private buyers, chefs, and international distributors. I slept in trailers during harvest seasons. I learned contracts, equipment, repair, export law, and agricultural science the hard way. When storms destroyed half a season's yield, I rebuilt. When markets crashed, I adapted. Every decision was mine. Every risk, mine. Every victory earned. By the time I turned 60, Blake Ridge Estate covered more than 100 acres and was valued well into 7 figures. I wasn't flashy rich, but I was secure, respected, and proud. I was also alone. My daughter Lena had grown into a strong, independent woman and moved across the country to build her own life. I encouraged it. I didn't raise her to orbit around me. Still, when the house grew quiet, the silence had weight. That's when Julian Krause entered my world. We met at a philanthropic gala, one of those polished events where everyone pretends they're there for charity instead of networking. Julian was charming in a controlled, practiced way. Late 60s, impeccably dressed, recently widowed, a former financial consultant with a calm voice and a way of listening that made you feel seen. He asked thoughtful questions about my work. Not the surfacely vague kind, real ones. He remembered details. He followed up. He admired what I had built without sounding threatened by it, or so I thought. He visited the estate a month later. Then again, we started having dinners, long conversations, quiet laughter. He spoke about companionship, about how lonely success could be at this stage of life. I wanted to believe him. After years of handling everything alone, having someone say, "You don't have to carry it all yourself anymore," felt like permission to breathe. We married after 10 months. The ceremony was intimate, elegant, held at my estate beneath old olive trees I had planted with my own hands. Julian's adult children attended, polite, smiling, observant. Too observant. There were 3 of them. Evan, the eldest, worked in finance and spoke in numbers even when pretending not to. Marissa, a real estate strategist who walked through my property like she was mentally dividing it into parcels. And Theo, the youngest, quiet, tech-savvy, and always watching. The questions began almost immediately. How long has this land been in your family? Do you manage the estate alone? Is ownership shared? Or are there trusts involved? I answered carefully, vaguely. I said what I had learned over years of negotiation to say it's complicated. Long-standing arrangements, family managed. What I did not say, what I never said to Julian or his children, was the truth. That Blake Ridge Estate belonged solely to me. Not inherited, not shared, not protected by anyone but my own foresight. I had a prenup, a solid one. My attorney insisted, and I listened. Julian signed it without protest, though I noticed the shift in his expression when I placed it in front of him. Something subtle, controlled. At the time, I ignored it. For the first year of marriage, things were fine, comfortable. Julian didn't interfere. He entertained guests, played the role of supportive husband, praised my discipline and intelligence in public. But comfort has a way of dulling instincts. By the second year, small things changed. Evan wanted to review numbers to help with long-term planning. Marissa brought insurance assessors to the estate without asking. Theo started suggesting digital restructures I didn't need. And Julian began placing papers in front of me. Routine updates. He'd say, "Standard marital protections. Just sign here." I stopped signing. That's when the warmth faded. The silences grew longer. The affection cooled. Conversations ended abruptly. I started noticing phone calls taken outside. whispered discussions that stopped when I entered a room. Still, I told myself I was being cautious, not paranoid, until the day I returned early from a supplier meeting and found Julian and his children inside my private office. My files spread across the desk. They froze when they saw me. And in that moment, standing there, looking at strangers rifling through my life's work, I felt something settle deep in my chest, a certainty. Whatever this marriage was, it was no longer safe. And I realized something else, something far more terrifying. They believed I didn't know my own worth. The first rule I ever learned in business was simple. If someone wants something from you, they'll try to make it sound like it was your idea. That rule saved me more than once over the years. And it was the reason I didn't confront Julian the day I caught him and his children in my office. I smiled instead. I asked calmly what they were looking for. Julian recovered quickly. He always did. Insurance documents, he said, his voice smooth, reasonable. Marissa was right, we should make sure everything's updated. This place is too valuable to risk. Too valuable. That phrase echoed in my mind long after they left. I locked the office. I changed passwords. I began copying files and backing them up off-site, quietly, methodically. I had survived recessions, droughts, and market crashes. I wasn't about to let complacency undo me now. Still, part of me wanted to believe this was just concern, family interest, overreach, maybe, but not malice. That illusion didn't last long. A week later, Julian slid another folder across the kitchen table while I was drinking my morning coffee. Just something my advisor suggested, he said. Spousal continuity planning. I read every word. It wasn't continuity planning. It was a limited financial authority agreement, limited in name only. It would allow him to act on my behalf in the event of incapacity. Incapacity, I asked, looking up, as determined by whom? Julian's jaw tightened for just a second. Doctors, courts, standard stuff. I closed the folder and slid it back. I'm not signing this. The temperature in the room changed. Why not? He asked, too quickly. Because I don't sign documents, I don't request, I said, and I don't hand control of my assets to anyone. He stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. We're married, Aurora. Yes, I said. Not merged. That was the first night he slept in the guest room. After that, the pressure stopped being subtle. Evan began calling more frequently. Always polite, always framed as help. You should really consider restructuring ownership for tax efficiency. Marissa sent emails with market analyses and unsolicited property valuations. One casually mentioned that estates like mine were selling for nearly double what I'd assumed. Theo started hinting at security vulnerabilities in my digital records. They weren't asking anymore. They were circling. What chilled me most wasn't their interest, it was how coordinated it felt, like a plan already in motion, like roles assigned. Julian changed, too. He became distant, then affectionate, then cold again, compliments followed by guilt. I worry about you, he'd say. You carry so much alone. Then, when I pushed back, I thought marriage meant partnership. Partnership, apparently, meant obedience. The moment everything tipped was 3 months later. I returned from a 2-day trip to meet with international buyers. When I walked into the estate office, my stomach dropped. A filing cabinet drawer was open. Nothing looked obviously missing, but something felt wrong. Papers slightly out of order. Folders misaligned. The air itself felt disturbed, like a room someone had searched too carefully. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made a call I hadn't planned on making. Grace Holloway, my attorney, a woman who didn't flinch easily. Grace, I said, keeping my voice steady, I need you to do a full title and records check on everything tied to Blake Ridge. Quietly, there was a pause. What's going on? I don't know yet, I said, but I need to know if anything's changed without my consent. She called me back 3 days later. I was standing among the olive trees when my phone rang, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the land I'd built from dust. Aurora, she said, and her tone alone made my hands go cold. Someone has filed documents with the county under your name. I couldn't breathe. What kind of documents? Preliminary transfer intentions. Partnership filings, none of them finalized yet, but enough to raise alarms. I never signed anything, I said. Never. I know, Grace replied. The signatures don't match. They're sloppy. Forgery. The word landed like a physical blow. Can they do that? I asked. They can file, she said. Whether it holds up is another matter. But Aurora, this isn't confusion. This is attempted fraud. I sat down right there in the dirt, my back against the trunk of a tree, older than my marriage. How long? I asked quietly. Some filings date back months, Grace said. Whoever did this assumed you wouldn't notice. I thought of Julian's calm smile, his children's questions, the folders, the pressure, the sudden urgency. They weren't testing boundaries, they were executing a strategy. Grace told me we needed to act immediately. Injunctions, reports, formal notices, but I asked her to wait. Give me 48 hours, I said. I wasn't ready to confront Julian yet. I needed to know who I was really married to. That night, I called an old contact from my early business years, Caleb Wright, a private investigator I'd once hired to vet partners on high-risk deals. I need everything, I told him. Financial history, legal disputes, marriages, especially the last one. He didn't ask questions. He never did. While Caleb worked, I watched. I watched Julian take phone calls outside. I watched Evan's visits become more frequent. I watched Marissa walk the property with a measuring gaze, like someone already imagining ownership. I played my role. I smiled. I nodded. I said I was thinking about it. Inside, something ancient and unyielding had woken up. 3 weeks later, Caleb called. Aurora, he said slowly. This isn't their first time. And as he began to explain what had happened to Julian's previous wife, I realized with terrifying clarity, I hadn't married a man. I had married a pattern. When Caleb told me Julian's past wasn't clean, I didn't interrupt him. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't even sit down. I stood in my kitchen, one hand resting on the counter I'd had custom cut 20 years earlier. And I listened like a woman who had already survived worse than betrayal. Aurora, Caleb said, I need you to understand this isn't speculation. This is documented behavior. That was when I knew this wasn't just about money. It was about control. Julian's first wife, Eleanor Cross, had died 6 years earlier. Public records said it was a sudden illness. Quiet, tragic. What they didn't highlight was what happened in the months before her death. Eleanor had transferred nearly everything she owned into Julian's name: real estate, investment accounts, even personal holdings. Less than half a year before she passed, she was diagnosed with early cognitive decline. Caleb said, memory issues, confusion, but nothing that legally prevented consent. Legally, I repeated. Yes, he said. Her sister tried to contest the transfers, claimed undue influence. What happened? I asked. Settled out of court, Caleb replied. Julian kept the assets. The sister got a fraction and a non-disclosure agreement. My skin prickled. There's more, Caleb continued. Before Eleanor, there was another marriage. Shorter, similar ending. Property transferred shortly before a fatal accident. No charges. No convictions. 2 wives, 2 estates, 2 conveniently timed transfers. And now me. I thanked Caleb and asked him to send everything. Every record, every filing, every quiet detail that never made headlines. When I hung up, I didn't confront Julian. Not yet. Instead, I became the version of myself that had built Blake Ridge from nothing, the woman who planned 3 steps ahead while others focused on the present. I gave Julian what he wanted, or at least, I let him think I did. I told him I'd reconsidered, that maybe I had been guarded. That marriage meant compromise. The relief on his face was immediate and fleeting. It wasn't gratitude, it was anticipation. He started bringing documents again. This time, I took them to Grace. Every single one. We discovered more forged filings, more attempted transfers, more evidence of coordination between Julian and his children. Emails, draft agreements, strategy notes saved in shared folders they thought were private. They had been planning to move fast, very fast. What stopped them wasn't morality, it was time, and they were running out of it. Grace brought in a forensic analyst who compared handwriting, timestamps, digital access logs. The pattern was unmistakable. Evan and Marissa were handling filings. Theo was manipulating digital records. Julian was orchestrating everything. I wasn't just dealing with a manipulative spouse, I was dealing with a family enterprise. And then we found something that shifted everything from civil dispute to criminal case. Medical documentation. Julian had attempted to schedule evaluations for me without my knowledge. Consultations framed as routine wellness planning. There were notes referencing future incapacity contingencies. He had been laying groundwork. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was about divorce. This was about survival. Grace advised me to file immediately, to move out, to alert authorities. I told her no, I want them caught in motion, I said. She stared at me. Aurora, that's dangerous. I've spent 30 years protecting this land, I replied. I'm not going to run now. So we planned, carefully, quietly. We allowed certain documents to progress, monitored, tracked, watched. We let them think their pressure was working, that I was softening, that I was tired. Julian grew confident, almost careless. He talked more. He boasted about future plans. He mentioned consolidations and streamlining operations as if he already owned them. His children followed his lead. They slipped. Evan sent an email discussing value extraction timelines. Marissa referenced potential buyers and zoning adjustments. Theo forwarded technical access requests he assumed I wouldn't understand. We captured everything. Then Grace contacted the district attorney. What we had wasn't just forgery. It was conspiracy, fraud, and elder exploitation. The DA assigned a detective, Maya Hernandez, sharp, direct, unimpressed by charm. She reviewed the evidence and said something I'll never forget. They've done this before, she said. And they're doing it again because they think you won't fight. I smiled. They've underestimated me, I replied. We needed a moment, a setting where they'd feel safe, confident, where they wouldn't suspect law enforcement. So I created one. I told Julian I wanted to host a private family gathering at the estate. Something symbolic, a reset, an anniversary dinner. He was thrilled. He told his children I was finally coming around. I invited them all. I also invited Grace, Caleb, Detective Hernandez, and 2 people Julian never expected to see again. Eleanor's sister, and the adult son of Julian's first wife. They arrived separately, quietly, with purpose. On the evening of the dinner, the estate looked exactly as it always had. Warm lights, long tables, glasses catching the sunset. Julian kissed my cheek and thanked me for trusting him again. I raised my glass and smiled, because trust had nothing to do with what came next. As everyone sat down, I watched Julian's face drain of color when he recognized the guests. What is this? He asked, standing halfway out of his chair. This, I said calmly, is the moment you realize I was never your mark. Detective Hernandez stepped forward. Julian Cross, she said, we need to talk. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was fear. And as I looked at the man who thought he could erase me from my own life, I felt no rage. Only clarity. The silence on the terrace felt heavier than any argument I had ever survived. Julian stood frozen, his hands still resting on the back of his chair, his mouth slightly open, as if words might come if only he could find the right lie quickly enough. He couldn't. Detective Hernandez didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Authority doesn't shout when it knows it's already won. Julian Cross, she said evenly. We are investigating multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted financial exploitation. You and your children are required to remain seated. Evan shot up first. This is outrageous, he snapped. You can't just barge into a private event. You're welcome to leave, Detective Hernandez replied calmly. After we place you under arrest. Marissa's face crumpled. Theo looked like he was about to vanish into the ground. And Julian, my husband, the man who once told me I didn't have to carry everything alone, said nothing. I stepped forward. For 3 years, I said, my voice steady, you believed I didn't know what I owned. You believed I was lonely enough to overlook manipulation, old enough to be managed, soft enough to be persuaded. Julian finally found his voice. Aurora, you're misunderstanding. No, I said quietly. I understand perfectly. Grace placed a folder on the table. Then another, and another. These, she said, are the forged filings you submitted. These are the email chains discussing asset control. These are the documents attempting to establish power of attorney without consent. Evan started shouting. Marissa cried. Theo whispered something about not knowing what was happening. Detective Hernandez raised her hand. Save it for your statements. Then, Eleanor's sister stepped forward. I tried to warn people, she said, her voice trembling but strong. He did this to my sister. He took everything while she was confused and scared. The son of Julian's first wife spoke next. My mother didn't understand what she was signing. She told me she felt trapped. Julian turned toward me then, his eyes burning. You planned this, he hissed. I met his gaze without flinching. I protected myself. There's a difference. Handcuffs clicked. One by one. The sound echoed across the land I had built, every tree, every stone, every acre that had watched me survive decades of storms. As they were led away, Julian slowed beside me. You didn't have to destroy us, he said bitterly. I leaned close enough that only he could hear. You destroyed yourselves the moment you thought my life's work was something you could steal. He was gone moments later. The legal process took months. Evan and Marissa accepted plea deals for fraud and forgery, prison sentences, restitution orders, careers finished, reputations erased. Theo cooperated, probation, permanent records. Julian fought. He always did, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial manipulation, elder exploitation, conspiracy. The court didn't see a charming widower. They saw a pattern. The sentence ended the way his story deserved it to, and the prenup held. He received nothing, not the land, not the estate, not a single olive tree. Today, I am 67 years old. Blackridge is thriving. My daughter came home not because I asked, but because she saw something worth standing beside. The estate is stronger, more transparent, and entirely mine. I never remarried. I don't regret love. I regret ignoring instincts. And that's why I tell this story. Not because I was almost robbed, but because I wasn't. Because sometimes survival doesn't look like escape. Sometimes it looks like standing still and refusing to be erased. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever built something with your own hands, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt pressure to give up control in the name of love, then stay here with me. Subscribe for more real stories about strength, truth, and reclaiming what's yours, and comment below, what would you have done differently if you were in my place? Because sharing these stories isn't just reflection, it's protection.